Good evening. Welcome to Progressive Soup. My name is David Stevenson. I'll be tonight's host. With me I have Ben Roberts, who's been with us on a couple of occasions, talking about a couple of other things he was involved in at the time. One being the Coffee Party, which you can look that up and learn a little bit more about that. Still in existence, and another project called 4 Years Go. This time we're going to talk about a relatively newer collaboration. In fact, it's the Conversation Collaborative. So it's a new collaboration.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Well, and it flows out of the work that I began doing with the Coffee Party movement back in February of 2010, when this was a political movement that emerged in reaction to the Tea Party. And what I saw was that there was this enormous potential for people to gather very quickly and a lot of energy. Mic check here. A lot of energy was emerging around this question of how do we oppose the Tea Party. And I became involved because I had been leading conversations for a year before that at a local coffee house in Sandy Hook, Connecticut, called Mocha.
Yeah.
And what the Coffee Party wanted to do was have people get together in coffee houses and have civil conversation. And because I'd been doing just that for a year, I immediately became closely involved with them. And they were planning a bunch of gatherings around the country. I think you came to the first one that we did at Mocha. And although I'd been leading conversations for a year then, it occurred to me that the stakes were a little higher now. This was politics and something I cared about. We were trying to start a movement,
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe I should find out a little bit more about conversational processes, and maybe people have figured some things out. I was just kind of winging it, and it was going very well.
I remember you telling me about the conversation you had with a family member that you used as a vehicle to figure out how to bridge this gap, to bridge this chasm, in fact, of
between right and left.
How people talk and
this was a conservative relative, right?
Yep.
And I had him take a look at a document to
buzzwords and things that probably people on both sides should avoid using, because it tends to set off the person they're talking to. It makes conversation more difficult when these words get thrown in.
Yeah, well, in that case, I was trying to draft a document. It was a declaration of inspiration, we called it, for the Coffee Party movement. And we wanted, the idea was, I know we're going to talk about the Coffee Party so much, but it is interesting.
Yeah.
So here's the Tea Party, and we were upset about it in part because it was so divisive, because they were attacking progressives, liberals like me, and vilifying us, and in a manner that wasn't about open conversation, but much more kind of a declaration of war, if you will. And so we said, well, we want to be the anti or the un-Tea Party. So what that actually means is we can't do to them what they're doing to us. We can't attack them and vilify them. We have to invite them down to the and sit at the table with us. We have to look for common ground. To be transpartisan is a term that's used a lot these days. And so when I wrote this document, it was important that it not offend people on the right. Mm-hmm. And that was an amazing exercise, because I was not able, it was the first time I had a conversation with this family member on the terrain of politics where we didn't just wind up shouting at each other within a short period of time.
So you saw some gains there, some methodology to get to a point where this kind of conversation can take place.
Well, not only that, but after we did that little exercise and he identified words in there that it didn't occur to me would offend somebody, but just because I wasn't sensitized in that way, we then talked about money in politics, which became the signature issue for the Coffee Party movement. And we agreed very quickly that it was corrosive and that there should be massive reform. So here's somebody from the far right agreeing with somebody from the far left that we need to get big money out of politics. And
seems like a natural.
It was 4 years ago. Point. It still hasn't happened, but and Citizens United came along. Well, I think that was maybe 2009 or 2008. The Citizens United decision.
It was, I believe, 2009, because I think it was in the 2010 State of the Union address that President Obama railed on that a little bit.
So it was already a factor at the time. Mm-hmm. Although I think the corrosive impact of money in politics.
It's been for a long time.
Yes,
maybe
Citizens
forever.
United just made it worse. But in any case, what happened for me with that experience with the Coffee Party movement is that I discovered there were all kinds of really wonderful processes for bringing large groups of people together in conversation. I already had discovered I had a gift for gathering people in conversation and for creating a safe space where diverse views could be heard, which isn't always about trying to find the perfect middle of the road language either.
Yeah.
It's more like just making it clear there's some ground rules here, and you're not gonna be run out of the room if you have the wrong opinion. You don't lose your place at the table if you don't meet some ideological litmus test. That kind of fairly simple thing that I knew how to do intuitively, but discovered with the Coffee Party that I really wanted to put that gift that I had only begun to realize I had. I wanted to put it in service to work that was about creating change.
Well, it seems like it was a gift, but it's also a gift that came through a lot of hard work. So maybe gift isn't the right word. It was.
Well, I think it's both. I think we discover our gifts, but then those are things you need to develop, right? And it's the combination of the two that really allows them to flourish and make a difference in your life, and perhaps be a way you can make a living, which has been my journey for the last 4 years.
Yeah.
So at the time, I was doing socially responsible investing. I was a financial advisor,
yes,
helping people to invest their money according to their values. And I continued to do that for about a year while I was involved with the Coffee Party movement, but all my energy was flowing into these conversational directions. You mentioned the 4 Years Go campaign. I got involved with that in July or June of 2010, and then that took me through the summer of 2011. And it was a similar thing. Here was a movement. This was about a higher level of transformation. So the Coffee Party was kind of grounded in traditional politics and really kind of fairly middle of the road. I mean, in a way, they latched on to getting money out of politics as a signature issue, partly because that's at the root of so much of what our struggles are about politically, but also because it's something that could bring the country together. 4 Years Go, on the other hand, looked at what was happening across a broad spectrum of activities, whether it's our economy or our government or our education system or what we're doing to the environment or even what our work situations are doing to our souls, and said, recognized as it built on thinking that has really emerged since the 60s, but been growing since then, that we need a fundamental paradigm shift across all these dimensions in how we organize ourselves, that we're really, we're suffering terribly, our communities are suffering terribly, the planet is suffering terribly, and it's not about right versus left. The left isn't addressing this either, at least in its traditional form. We still worship at the altar of economic growth, for example, as if unlimited exponential growth and consumption of resources and production of waste is viable, and we justify it because we say we need full employment, but never mind that the jobs aren't really worthwhile things to do. What are we spending our time doing? So this much deeper look at things called to me quite powerfly, and the 4 Years Go campaign was an entry into that work. Then came the Occupy movement. So 4 Years Go, similar to the Coffee Party, it was a very, a lot of energy in this initiative, but after about a year, it just kind of unraveled. It didn't gel, it didn't take off, it didn't move to the next level it needed to really, make it to a wider level of consciousness. But then, and so I was with a group of people that I had connected with through the 4 Years Go campaign, trying to figure out, well, what's our next move? Where do we go? And the theme for me all along was conversation.
Yep.
Was using the power of bringing people together in groups, because this is a collective process of change. That the new paradigm says you can't figure this out on your own. That it's a community effort always, and there's wisdom in the community and going to the broadest levels of public engagement, or within an organization even, to go from a very strict kind of hierarchical command and control approach to something that really says, we're all in this together and we need to think as a whole, and we can do that.
How important is that conversation to be face-to-face as opposed to online.
Right. So that's the other dimension that's been the theme for me in all of this work for these past 4 years, is to realize that we actually have tools to do things virtually that we've only up until now attempted in person, and the virtual realm allows us to bring groups together and connect people as we know, in much larger numbers and much more quickly. I mean, there was the coffee party movement as a great example where 100,000 people a month for 3 months straight were we're liking their Facebook page and becoming engaged in this movement. So it's the power of the internet was one thing, and the power of these large group conversations was another, and it was the intersection of the two that really fascinated me.
Yeah.
And looking for different places where I could apply that in different movements for transformation, movements for systemic change. And so Occupy became the next one after the coffee party and 4 years ago. For a year and a half, I ran something called Occupy Cafe along with another partner. It was a virtual conversation space inspired by and related to and connecting the Occupy movement with the wider world.
Yep, and we had Occupy Danbury, and our main focus was move your money, taking money out of large corporate banks and putting it in local banks, and that's something that within my realm of real estate, I still have opportunities to talk about that a little bit in passing with people, and it seems to make sense to everybody, and it's just a matter of avoiding the onslaught of commercials for large banks and just look at the basic.
Well, it's part of this larger movement of localism that's a big part of the shift or the paradigm shift or transformation. That's showing up in all these different places. And one of the core principles is that we need to once again be much more self-reliant, that our communities need to become communities again, and we need to realize that we can do much more for ourselves rather than outsourcing it all to large systems, whether it's the government or corporations, global trade, et cetera, et cetera.
There's another word that seems to strike a very strong nerve across the political spectrum: outsourcing.
Yeah.
And you see outsourcing to anybody, and 9 times out of 10, probably 95 out of 100, people will say, no, I don't like that. It's not a good thing.
Right.
But what do we do about it?
Yeah. Well, and the traditional frame is American jobs are going overseas and we need to bring them back here. But, but that, again, misses the much larger picture of what's going on, I think, which is that, there's a fundamental shift. First of all, you have to think globally. I certainly do. So, Chinese people need jobs. Vietnamese people need jobs. African people need jobs. It's not, the solution isn't that we hoard all the jobs and keep them from going over there.
Right.
That doesn't serve us globally, and it's increasingly a small planet. The problem is that the traditional jobs, the jobs that our economic system has evolved to support in this modern day version of corporate capitalism that we have, we don't have enough of those jobs, and they don't, for the whole planet to make a living.
Yeah.
And the jobs that are able to support a decent standard of living are some of them are going away. Those classic kind of middle class jobs. So we're seeing this huge schism of a small sector becoming incredibly wealthy, but most of the world in some ways being left behind.
And how do you judge a person's worth financially?
Well, to put money as the ultimate judge of anything is at the root of a lot of what our problems are. We've made a god. If anything's sacred on this planet, it's money now, and that's absurd. And the things that are of greatest value to us, as we know, can't be measured, can't be bought, can't be traded, and yet we have made economic growth the prime value that drives everything, and that worked in a lot of ways. It brought us to a place here in the beginning of the 21st century where you and I can live lives of unbelievable richness. I mean, we live better than kings lived, even 100 years ago. It's phenomenal the way, the lives we get to lead, but at what price? And it's not something that can continue. We're running out of the ability to, absorb the wastes we're producing, whether it's carbon or many other things. We're burning through topsoil, we're running out of water. fossil fuels, etc. And we've gotten so efficient at making things, because efficiency driven by profit has been the prime goal, that again we don't need to employ people anymore. It's like what's happened in manufacturing is what happened to agriculture before. You used to have vast majority of people worked on farms. Now it's 6%.
And they were, and the whole family was busy doing it, and
right.
Then you get to the point where a family couldn't get by for some reason, couldn't get by just doing the agriculture, and
we got very efficient at agriculture.
Yeah.
Fossil fuels came in, and then we mechanized production. Prices plummeted. We had more food than we needed. You had the Dust Bowl. Mm-hmm. And the same thing's happening with manufacturing. We're so good at making stuff so cheaply that we don't need to employ 30, 40, 50% of the planet making things anymore. We only need a small slice of the people making things. And what else are you going to do? And when we shifted from agricultural to industrial jobs, we also had powerful unions. And so those industrial jobs were good paying jobs. Now we're supposedly replacing the manufacturing jobs with service jobs, but a huge majority of them are not paying well. And we don't have the clout with labor anymore to demand that be the case. And so you don't have the basis for, vast majorities of people. I heard a phrase the other day on the radio, the 66%. That's the percentage that are in the low paying service jobs in this country. Whether it's
66?
It's food service and sales and clerical work, as opposed to the creative class. They're doing very, very well. Whether it's in business or in entertainment or other sectors, tech industry as well, all these kind of creative new economy jobs. Anyway,
yeah.
I think if you look globally what's happening, that's just another one of these dimensions where we clearly are not going to have a world that we want our children and our grandchildren to live in. They won't be flourishing in the way that we're actually privileged to do now if we don't change course. This was the premise of 4 years ago, too, that we only had, let's call it 4 years to turn around and stop, accelerating off a cliff. And the hope was that by the end of this year, this is the fourth year, we would have at least turned around. We wouldn't have created the world that we want, but we, at least would be moving towards a world where all people can thrive, which is still perhaps possible, although one wonders, have we crossed the threshold where maybe we can't do that anymore for one reason or another? And it's certainly easy to lose hope, to become despairing if you look, take a hard look at the facts. So again, the work I find myself doing now, we created the Conversation Collaborative coming out of Occupy Cafe.
Yes.
Because people loved the conversations we were convening in that context, or they wanted to apply it in ways that didn't have the Occupy label on it. So there are all kinds of different organizations and initiatives and movements that could use that wanted to gather people together in dialogue to help get them engaged in what they were doing, to help generate new thinking, to help the movement to grow, to make connections across organizations and movements. So part of this is that they're really, in some ways, there's a movement of movements that one could talk about.
Movement of movements.
The movement of movements. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we talked about the economic slice, and we haven't really talked about the political slice. But clearly, our government is just completely, it's not functional anymore. Money, we did talk about a little bit, money at the root of politics. So you have that, the movement to reclaim democracy is another movement. You have the environmental movement. I think the climate movement deserves its own wedge all by itself because that's so critical. You have the peace movement. Is another very important dimension, whether it's international conflict or how we handle what we criminalize or not within our society, our prison system, all of that. So all of these things, though, really, to me, are part of a greater whole. And one of the initiatives that I'm working with now through the Conversation Collaborative actually is addressing that very nicely. The 4 Years Ago campaign, I think, did it too, but this one is maybe sort of stepping into the space that was left by that.
But isn't the notion that this notion of government's not working, that it's not serving our interests, isn't this kind of, hasn't it kind of always been that way, and somehow we managed to get through that? We go in these cycles where the government
I think it's different now.
In what way?
Well, So I heard a new term the other day. We've heard about things like peak oil and peak water. The idea that we've hit the maximum level that we can produce of certain commodities. But the suggestion that this gentleman had was that we've also reached peak hierarchy. We've reached the limit of our ability to manage the complexity of what is going on this planet from a traditional top-down hierarchical model. Mm-hmm. So our government is based on the notion of that pyramid, that we can elect a few people and they can figure out what's going on and make reasonably sensible and wise decisions, on behalf of all of us. And it's just not true anymore. The world is too complicated, and individual nation states are much more connected than they used to be. The economy is much more global. There are more people. There are more stresses. All the issues we have to deal with are multidimensional and super complex, and they can't be solved through traditional partisan divides either. I mean, we're not going to get out of our shift to a carbon-free economy if we don't bring some substantial portion of the right on board with this. This can't be a left versus right issue, and you see the same thing. Money in politics would be another one. So all these things we need to fix have this complex social dimension. They're about dealing with, the models of what worked in the past aren't working in the future. So I think actually that our government, it's not, yes, our government's never been perfect, to be sure, but it's gotten us to where we are, with growth, for example, has worked. Growth isn't going to work anymore. We need to figure out how to thrive without growth. Right. And that's our system doesn't know how to do that. You need a fundamental shift. If you go back again to what happened from the shift from the agrarian society to industrial society, we needed World War II to do that. Mm-hmm. Well, it was unintentional industrial policy. What's going to be the equivalent of that kind of a massive external force that gets us to make this change? I don't think it can come from within the systems we have now.
Doesn't the hierarchy, those that have the greater portion of the power, isn't this, though, the same old story? And this is appropriate probably for St. Patrick's Day, being Irish, predominantly Irish, that the hierarchy will try to divide. I guess divide and conquer is the term I'm looking for. You try to split up the population into two camps, set them at war against one another, so that they lose sight of the fact that the hierarchy, in the case of Ireland, the British government, set the Protestants against the Catholics, and meanwhile it kept them away from the notion that, by the way, the one that was causing the problems in Ireland were, in fact, the British monarchy.
Well, certainly, divide and conquer is one strategy that you can use from a command and control position. But the problem of hierarchy is much bigger than that. Our corporations traditionally have been run as hierarchies. And so you might have had, you say, management versus labor, but it wasn't like, I don't think the divide and conquer analogy quite works in the same way there. Or you look at the way any large bureaucracy tries to function and how difficult it is to manage the complexity of what we have there. Or look at our energy system, right? So if we're going to convert to clean, renewable energy, the best model that I've seen is distributed generation instead of centralized power plants and these massive public infrastructure investments. Mm-hmm. We want millions and millions of small scale generating. Everybody is a power generator with solar panels on their roof and wind power and things like that. And all of that links together in a networked system. So in a network like the internet, nobody's in charge. There isn't anybody on top, right? And that's really the model across all of these dimensions that I see being the way, the way that we have to solve things.
Doesn't it kind of follow the notion of localized banking, where you have localized, say, the Danbury and the towns around it have their windmills and solar panels and other things.
And it can all be linked together into a globally networked system.
So if you have a shortage here, you can borrow a little from there, or vice versa. But for the most part, everything is centralized within the local area.
Well, it's all distributed, and it's much more resilient as a result. There's a lot of duplication. It's not the most efficient way to do things if you're trying to, put the minimum investment in and get the maximum return out. But that's a very brittle system, and it only works if you've got a lot of growth to support it, and you've got a lot of surplus capacity and extra energy and things of that sort. And those are the kinds of constraints we're running up against now. So, and all of that growth has come at a terrible cost. We've essentially had to continue to commodify everything that matters in life, and so we need to learn to take that back and realize that our highest value is not as a consumer. It's in the human heart. And so that lives within ourselves, within our homes, within our communities. And then, by extension, certainly to the degree we can identify with the whole planet, we need to do that. We need to see ourselves as all being in this together.
That seems very very rational, and like you say, we've always been talking about. There's always been this need for growth. We need to have more of this, more of that. When people need to buy more things in order to sustain the economy, and we need to increase the population. And I guess now even China and India are beginning to come to grips with the fact that there is not a light at the end of the tunnel with population growth, but there is
and even economic growth.
Look deep chasm.
Yeah, look at the air pollution that China is suffering from. So they recognize that certain models of economic growth aren't going to work for them either.
And they're apparently coming to grips with that, which is a good thing.
Well, they know they can't avoid the fact that it's a problem when you can't see across the street, right?
Yeah, that's pretty self-evident.
Awful.
Yeah.
And I think another thing that's at the root of this, and this is where the kinds of conversations, the best conversations that I've been able to convene have been sort of miniature experiences of this kind of connectedness and of valuing one another and valuing what's possible that we can create together, whether it's that group or thinking about the whole planet at in a different way. So it's an experience of what it might be like to be in a different paradigm where we don't think of ourselves as completely separate and isolated, cogs in a machine, and even the whole universe is basically a mechanical system that's just, atoms bouncing into one another, and there's nothing really alive. There's no sacred life energy. But the new view of the universe, as well as the view of how we need to reorganize ourselves on this planet, is that it's a living universe. It's alive. Everything's deeply interconnected, rather than a machine-like system. And if we can bring that sacred life energy to the surface and make that the highest value, what serves life? What serves my connection to you and to this planet and everyone on it? Not what makes the most money. That's the kind of conversation that I'm finding many opportunities to have.
And again, back to the internet, where the internet, at the very same time, it brings us all closer together, but it allows and encourages sometimes the division of us, keeps us separate.
It certainly can, and yet I think it also, the jury's still out, and it's hard to see what it's doing. But I see it also as presenting this incredible opportunity for connection, and that's the way that I've been pursuing.
And with that, we're going to have to call it a day. And thank you for joining us, Ben. It's been
my pleasure, David.
Always good food for thought for people to start your own little collaborative, and keep talking, stop fighting, keep talking, find common ground, and that's what we like.